Hi there, it's Lerald, and today I'm going to be talking about the Sand Lane Blood and Unholy Death Knight Hero Talent Tree. I already talked about the Mountain Thane Protection Warrior Fury Warrior Talent Tree yesterday and kind of gave an overview of the hero talent system that's going to be in the War Within. That's the new power system that players are going to get in leveling through the new content. So we're going to skip right over that and just get directly into analyzing this tree. So let's start at the top, and that is sort of the trend-setting concept here, the Vampiric Strike. Maybe I should first start by saying this is the overlap of Blood and Unholy. Sand Lane, Blood and Frost get Deathbringer, and then Frost and Unholy get Rider of the Apocalypse, which is a really cool name. Probably, very much like a glow-in-the-dark t-shirt of a name, but very cool. Big fan of Rider of the Apocalypse. And Sand Lane definitely seems like it's more influenced by blood than Unholy. There's a little bit of disease stuff, a little bit of pet stuff happening, but it's very much about blood and shadow magic and leeching health in healing yourself and getting a lot of haste, and that all screams blood. And that really lines up with the Sand Lane as a concept, because those were the sort of shadow magic and blood magic using vampire guys from Wrath of the Lich King. So, with that being said, let's get right into Vampiric Strike here. Your Death Coil and Death Strike have a 10% chance to make your next Heart Strike or Scourge Strike become Vampiric Strike. Vampiric Strike heals you for 3% of your maximum health and grants you Essence of the Blood Queen, increasing your haste by 1.5% up to 7.5% for 20 seconds. So that means it stacks up to 5 times. There's not an indication of whether each time you stack it up again, it refreshes all the way, or if it's something that sort of has like rolling stacks, like a Druid's Iron Fur, where you can have overlapping stacks, but the duration won't refresh. There just are separate independent durations on that buff. How that works isn't clear. If it is just a sort of normal buff that you stack up to 5 times and maintain at max stacks all the time, that kind of becomes a bit of a maintenance buff, and it's a little bit outside of what Blizzard has said they want this system to be. I think if it is just simply the ability to have separate stacks and maintain them, and they all have their own separate duration, but the cap is there, so there's not some degenerate situation where you're able to stack it like 50 times and have infinite haste. That probably is how this works. Not sure either way. We don't have confirmation on that yet. And so now we'll come over here to this first choice node, and it is just a utility node, newly turned, makes your Raise ally revive players at max health and give you an absorb shield equal to 20% of your maximum health. This is pretty valuable for, I mean, really, this is pretty valuable for both rating and Mythic Plus. Being able to get full health res is really, really useful. Like, that is one of the most dangerous times in a raid for somebody who has died, is as soon as they're getting res back up, they need to be health potting or health stoning or getting some sort of big heals on them, because there's a very real possibility that if you died to something that does a lot of ticking damage, some boss fight that does a lot of damage, you res and instantly die again. That's no good. So this is pretty good utility, and it makes it so that you're not being punished for spending that runic power on a res. You're getting a shield out of it, so it's not all bad. The alternative is Vampiric Speed. Death's Advance and Wraith Walk are 10% more move speed E, and they give a very small move speed bonus to up to 4 nearby allies. 20% for 5 seconds is, 20% move speed isn't nothing. It's enough to help with dodging mechanics that you're already getting out of, but it's not exactly like a Wraith or whatever, a Wind Rush Totem or a Stampeding Roar. It's more like, oh, I think I might have been moving a little bit faster. I couldn't really tell. Bloodsoaked Ground for blood basically just plays into the way that you already play the class. While you're within Death and Decay, your physical damage taken is reduced by 5%, and you gain an additional 5% chance to get Vampiric Strike. So right now that's 10% chance from each Death Coil or Death Strike, so that becomes 15. This is totally fine and normal for blood. You do use Death and Decay even in single target, so that's pretty great. For Unholy, you don't use Death and Decay in single target, and this basically seems like it would incentivize you to do so, so it makes the Unholy playstyle quite a bit more like blood. We're kind of seeing the same thing that we saw with the Mountain Thane, where this is a talent setup that I kind of would hope would make Blood play more like Unholy. I think in this case it makes sense with the Sand Lane being what they are, that it makes Unholy play more like Blood. In the case of the Warrior, it also makes Fury play more like Prot, and that's okay, certainly comfortable for me, but maybe I wanted the exact opposite to be what's happening. Vampiric Aura and Bloody Fortitude is the second choice node, and Vampiric Aura is pretty mild, 3% increased leech, and while Lichborn is active, that amount is doubled, and it affects 4 nearby allies. So there is some Mythic Plus value, 6% leech during your Lichborn for not just yourself, but for everybody in the group. That's okay. I think that probably could have some value in PvP. Certainly it could have some value as an Unholy DK, being able to use that and give a little bit of extra juice for the group. But it's not huge. By comparison, Bloody Fortitude, Icebound Fortitude reduces all damage you take by up to an additional 30% based on your missing health. Huge. This has always been the problem with Icebound Fortitude. The amount of damage reduction that it provides sucks compared to every other shield wall. It just doesn't give a lot of damage reduction, and now it can go all the way up to 60% health, or 60% damage reduction if you're on very low health. That's great. And then, as an extra bonus, killing enemies that grant honor or experience reduces the cooldown of Icebound Fortitude by 3 seconds. So in Mythic Plus, you can have an Icebound Fortitude cooldown that's like with, what is the name of the talent? With the talent that reduces its cooldown by just a flat minute. Icebound Fortitude and Acclamation, there we go. You could go all the way down from the base 3-minute cooldown with Acclamation and killing a large 10-pack of mobs. You could get into the 90-second, 80-second cooldown range on a shield wall that's also a stun break. And now, instead of being a very weak shield wall, it can be pretty good. As good or better than all of the rest of the shield walls, including shield wall itself. Over on the left side here, we have Infliction of Sorrow, and this is, I would say, probably the most interesting talent in this entire tree, probably the one talent here that really has any sort of rotational impact, any sort of interesting complexity or nuance to it, and it kind of is stealing from the current Protection Warrior tier set bonus. And here it goes. When Vampiric Strike damages an enemy affected by Blood Plague or Virulent Plague, it consumes the disease, dealing 200% of the remaining damage. That's pretty cool. That's quite a bit of damage, potentially, and if you're using Heart Strike, or I guess Vampiric Strike, in Death and Decay, in AoE, you can hit 5 targets and, cleave all of them, and presumably that would pop the Blood Plague off of all of them and do 200% of that remaining damage. So there's quite a bit of an incentive there for this effect to, be a source of burst AoE damage, or at least 5 target cleave damage. That's pretty cool. And then it creates the rotational impact of, as soon as you've popped that, you want to hit Blood Boil or whatever. You want to reapply your Blood Plague or Virulent Plague. Outbreak would be the other skill. While Gift of the Sand Lane is active, Vampiric Strike no longer consumes your disease and it instead extends the duration of your disease by 3 seconds and deals 20% of the remaining damage to the enemy. Now that's pretty impactful for Unholy. The ability to extend the duration of the disease, that's fine, I guess. For Blood, that's basically worthless, but it's fine. I will say that going from doing 200% of the remaining damage to doing only 20% of the remaining damage kind of seems like a bit of a nerf. Maybe that's a typo. Maybe the top number is a typo. Maybe both of these numbers are perfect and they would need some tuning there. Either way, it does seem a little weird to have the buff, the bottom of the tree buff, be like this massive damage reduction on that effect, but there are some other tuning concerns that we'll get to in a bit. Frenzied Bloodthirst makes it so the Essence of the Blood Queen stacks 2 additional times and increases the damage of your Death Coil and Death Strike by 5% per stack. That's pretty cool. Essence of the Blood Queen is the haste buff, so now instead of 1.5% per stack up to 5 stacks, you now go up to 7 stacks, so you would get 10.5% haste as your cap, and that lasts for still 20 seconds. So 10.5% more haste as a Blood DK, stacking with improved Bone Shield, baseline 10% haste. That's pretty good. That's pretty much the exact thing that you want as a Blood DK. So that feels great. And I mean, Unholy DK isn't exactly going to be upset about having a bunch of haste either. Here we have the Blood is Life. Vampiric Strike has a chance to summon a Blood Beast to attack your enemy for 10 seconds. Now we have no idea what that chance is, 1%, 1 proc per minute. That's usually what it is, 1 proc per minute, so that's okay. Each time the Blood Beast attacks, it stores a portion of the damage dealt, and when the Blood Beast dies, it explodes, dealing 50% of the damage accumulated to nearby enemies and healing the Death Knight for the same amount. All of these numbers are like stabs in the dark. We have no idea. Is that a lot of damage? Is it terrible? Don't really know, but we can kind of look at the design here and say this is sort of like an enhanced blood worm. You know, if we look at blood worms over here in the blood decay tree, your auto attacks have a chance to summon a blood worm. It deals very small amount of damage and it heals you for some of your health that's missing. This is a bit different. It stores up some of that damage and then it will blast that damage to enemies like as an AoE, but then also as a heal for you. So it's thematically pretty consistent. It's totally passive. There's not really anything you can do. There's not anything you can do to boost the Blood Beast damage, not anything you can do to boost its proc rate, not really anything you can do to like time needing that heal or anything. So it's fine. I mean, it's totally passive, hard to complain about, but it isn't really anything you have control over or have any sort of interaction with. Basically just free money. Here we have Visceral Regeneration. Your Heart Strike and Scourge Strike have a 3%, well, it says have a 3% per stack. I assume a 3% chance per stack of Essence of the Blood Queen to refund a rune. Vampiric Strike doubles the chance to refund a rune. So with up to 7 stacks of Essence of the Blood Queen, that's a 21% chance to refund a rune when you hit Heart Strike or Scourge Strike. And with Vampiric Strike being active instead, that doubles up to 42% chance. This is huge. This is basically the return of runic empowerment for blood. It's not exactly how it works, since that was always tied to hitting Death Strike and, or I guess way back in the day, Death Coil or Rune Strike. But either way, spending your runic power and then getting runes back. This is more you're spending a rune and then immediately having it refunded. But in either case, getting runes back is great. So now this talent tree is sort of coming into form. You have healing, you have tons of haste, you have damage reduction, you have damage output, you have more haste, you have runes being refunded. Basically, this is all of the things that you would want as a blood DK, and that's pretty nice. The only real downside here is that it is kind of passive. And on that note, let's look at Incite Terror. Heart Strike and Scourge Strike extend the duration of Essence of the Blood Queen by half a second. Vampiric Strike increases the extension by 100%. Now, this is why I have, I don't know, some questions about whether this is just a normal buff. If this line wasn't here at all, I would just assume this is a normal buff that when you refresh it, it goes all the way back up to 20 seconds. But because of this, because of being told that it extends the duration, that is what makes me think it functions more like Iron Fur, some sort of set of buffs that have all their own independent timers. Or, I don't know, maybe it just, once you start the buff, it's 20 seconds to get as many stacks as you can, and then once that 20 seconds ends, it falls off and you have to cycle back up. That actually could be a pretty interesting gameplay loop as well. In either case, you have an incentive to hit Heart Strike quite a bit, which I think is fine. That is basically how you play Blood DK, and obviously Blizzard is squirrely about getting back into the Season 3 and Season 4 of Shadowlands playstyle, where you're hitting Dancing Rune Weapon and then hitting Heart Strike over and over and over again at the expense of other things. But hitting Heart Strike is a big part of how you play a Blood DK. You know, you maintain all of your maintenance buffs, you maintain Bone Shield, you maintain Death and Decay, you maintain Blood Plague, and then you hit Heart Strike with pretty much everything else you can, and you spend Runic Power on Death Strike. That's kind of how you play Unholy DK as well. You maintain all your diseases and all of your utility stuff. You dump Runic Power with Death Coil as needed, but then you do pretty much hit Scourge Strike as much as you're able to. So I think this is all pretty much fine. All right, now let's look at Sanguine Scent and Pact of the Sand Lane. Sanguine Scent reads, your Death Coil and Death Strike have a 15% chance to trigger Vampiric Strike when damage enemies below 35% health, and it is guaranteed to critically strike. All right, so the wording here, aside from any grammatical mistakes, is a little confusing because it's not clear whether the Death Strike or Death Coil is guaranteed to critically strike or the Vampiric Strike is guaranteed to critically strike. But in either case, this means more execute damage for Blood DK, more execute damage for Unholy DK too, which, you know, honestly, they both have really good execute damage now, but the thing is, with execute damage, you can never have too much of it, so there's nothing wrong with that at all. In terms of the extra chance to trigger, this boosts the baseline 10% chance up to 15, and presumably it works with Blood-Soaked Ground, so you're going to be going from 15% chance on average if you're standing in Death and Decay up to a whopping 20%. That's pretty good. More execute damage is pretty great. Additionally, it's not in the tooltips here, but Epidemic does work with this if you're playing Unholy and using Epidemic in AoE situations. So that is a potential for this to do more more damage. Now, we don't exactly know how this would work with Epidemic, if the main target would have to be below 35% health, or if any of the targets if it'll trigger, but that is pretty interesting as well. Then we have Pact of the Sand Lane, which causes you to store 50% of all shadow damage that you deal, it's not exactly written that way, into your Blood Beast, that then explodes for that additional damage when it expires. So this has potential to be really useful for Unholy DK, especially in those situations where you're hitting Epidemic over and over again and you're doing lots of AoE shadow damage. You could be storing up a lot of damage for that Blood Beast to explode with. As a Blood DK, your shadow damage is pretty limited. The amount of shadow damage skills you even have is basically 3 rotational ones. You have Blood Boil, I guess you have Blood Plague, passive damage, you have Death and Decay, and then you have Death's Caress. But Death Strike, Marrow Rend, Heart Strike, those are all physical damage skills. Now, we don't know for sure if maybe Vampiric Strike deals shadow damage. It's not written that it does, but maybe it deals shadow damage, and so then you might have the potential to get a little bit of shadow damage juice here with this. But I would say, generally speaking, this looks like it's not a great talent for Blood DKs, even in full-scale AoE, whereas Sanguine Scent seems very, very strong for single-target execute damage for Blood DKs and Unholy DKs, and I think it's probably going to be the go-to for Blood DKs in all situations, whereas Pact of the Sand Lane may have some legs to it for Unholy in AoE. And finally, we have Gift of the Sand Lane, which is just a passive. While Vampiric Blood or Dark Transformation is active, you gain Gift of the Sand Lane. Gift of the Sand Lane increases the effectiveness of your Essence of the Blood Queen by 100% and replaces your Heart Strike and Scourge Strike with Vampiric Strike for the duration. So one of the complaints that I've seen about this is that it's tied to Vampiric Blood, a totally defensive cooldown, and it turns it into a very offensive cooldown. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a problem. We've seen that work out all right, and it does really fit in nicely with some of the talents that Blood DK has. You know, we're talking Red Thirst and Umbilicus Aeternus. It is nice to see those kind of come together and really give you an incentive to use that basically on cooldown. Pretty good in Mythic Plus, potentially pretty good in Raid, actually. The only real downside is, you know, you are popping what is basically just a defensive cooldown as an offensive cooldown, so that means in situations where you have to hold it to stay alive, you're losing damage, and that is frustrating for people. So there has been the suggestion of moving it to Dancing Rune Weapon. Both Dancing Rune Weapon and Vampiric Blood are defensive cooldowns, offensive cooldowns, whatever, cooldowns that you can get cooldown reduction built into as a Blood DK. And Dancing Rune Weapon is definitely the more default cooldown one, you know, going out of your way to really pick up Red Thirst both points and actually emphasize cooldown reduction on that is a little bit less common than Dancing Rune Weapon, where that's basically the thing that ties the whole class together. So I think that shifting it from Vampiric Blood to Dancing Rune Weapon might make design sense, but it doesn't make thematic sense. You know, this is a blood class, this is a bloody vampire, that's the theme, and having it be on Vampiric Blood makes more thematic sense, even if it doesn't work as well in terms of the total design. In any case, getting double effect of Essence of the Blood Queen, again, that haste buff that you could stack up to 10.5%, now you're doubling it to 21% haste during your Vampiric Blood, or maybe Dancing Rune Weapon, depending on what Blizzard decides to do. That's pretty huge. That's a really, really powerful set of bonuses. So I think in conclusion here, this is a really interesting tree. I think it really hits all the thematic notes that Blizzard is going for, and I think it adheres to what they're looking to do with these hero talent trees of making things that just make you stronger at the stuff you already do, and don't add a ton of extra complexity. I would say this is probably the least complex of all of the trees that we've seen. Does that mean it's bad? Not at all. I think it's really good, and I think it's probably going to push Blood DK from being, already the most popular raid tank in the game to staying in the top spot. You can't really go from one to a number higher than that. But right now, this talent tree looks amazing, and Blood DK seems like it's gonna maintain the top dog spot based on what we've seen elsewhere. But we'll see. You have no idea what the other tanks and what the other classes have in store for them, or even what Deathbringer has in store for Blood DK. My expectation is that this will be the more raid-oriented setup, and the Frost setup will be more AoE-oriented and more useful for Mythic Plus, but you never know. In any case, I think this is all pretty exciting, and I really can't wait for the War Within. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.